Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. Is sugar addiction a very real thing?
Good morning, Sally. Thank you for having me on the show. And I'll try to answer your very valid question as concisely as possible. One answer is that sugar addiction has not been formally recognized as a condition in and of itself. Now, this does not mean it doesn't exist. It just means there's not quite enough data yet for us to be sure that sugar constitutes an addiction as it would with other drugs. However, having said that, there's a lot of very interesting research that suggests that sugar, in fact, affects the brain in such a way that we can consider it to be addictive. For example, there have been some fascinating animal studies on rats where they, for example, have opted to use sugar instead of cocaine. They, for example, are willing to cross an electric fence in order to access an M&M. And I'm sure that resonates with a lot of us. You know, we know that it's not good for us, and yet we're willing to put ourselves in harm's way in order to access that little bit of sugary goodness. And I think that really speaks to, you know, the properties of sugar, which can affect the brain in such a way as to lead us to, you know, choose sugary snacks over our own well-being.
I was doing a little bit of reading, and of course you're the expert, so if I get this wrong, please correct me gently. But apparently there are things called endogenous opioids that are released when we eat sugar. Is that true?
That is correct. And so that is a process happening in the brain in response to sugary foods. Now, this does happen to some extent with healthy foods, but not nearly on the same scale as sugary foods. And what's interesting about this phenomenon is that those same neurochemical processes are happening when we, for example, are using drugs such as heroin or cocaine.
You know what's interesting is that I know that as a clinical psychologist you work with sort of serious psychiatric disorders. However, I've also spoken to someone who's a former heroin addict, and she said to me it is harder for her to kick sugar than it was to kick heroin. Is it really true that it can be almost as addictive as these very hardcore drugs?
Look, I think it's really a matter of individual cases, and sugar substances in general will affect different people differently. If we think about heroin, it has an incredibly powerful effect on the brain, and that's exactly what makes heroin one of the most addictive substances that is out there. So, I mean, on the surface, one wouldn't expect sugar to always have that same effect, and 9 times out of 10, I mean, I would be much more comfortable with my patients eating sugar than taking heroin. Having said that, food brings with it very subtle and different connotations for different people. And apart from, you know, the neurochemical processes happening in the brain, we also attach our own meanings to sugar. And the story that you're describing is quite phenomenal, and I've certainly seen, you know, in some of my own patients, the strength of addiction to sugar that is comparable to how somebody else might respond to a hard drug like heroin.
And I think the other thing is that heroin obviously is taboo and it's illegal, whereas sugar is freely available. It's in almost everything we eat. And as you say, depending on the form of sugar, it can go straight to the brain, like a zip wire almost.
Yes, absolutely. And you'll notice also when you go to the shops, when you're standing in the aisle to wait to pay for your groceries, it's not vegetables and healthy juices that are staring you in the face there, is it? It's chocolate bars.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think, yeah, and what you said is spot on, because sure, drugs are illegal, sugar is very much not, and the consumers are taken advantage of to some extent by the people who are producing these foods. It's so easy to reach out and grab a chocolate bar. So,
and you'll tell me something. What are the warning signs that my love of sugar is out of control? What are the signs that for you would suggest alarm? I know that with normal addiction, it's if your life is dysfunctional. So how do you define dysfunctional around sugar? Is it that simply, as with, say, for example, alcohol addiction, you can't stop when you want to, which unfortunately describes almost anyone who's been on a diet ever?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are some signs to look out for. I think the most obvious one is an awareness that sugar is causing you harm, whether immediately due to a stomachache or whether in the long term. You might know that sugar, if you consume it as you are now, is going to cause health difficulties later down the line. Despite that knowledge, there isn't quite enough motivation to stop. and although you try to cut down your sugar, you find that you're not managing. You may also find that you're needing to use more and more sugar, as in, after a long day of work, you need a chocolate bar in order to feel okay. And the next day, you might find yourself having one chocolate bar and not feeling that that's quite enough. So the use starts to escalate. And those are three very good signs that what you're sitting with is somewhat of an addictive process.
So as with many addictive substances, it seems the best way is total abstinence. Is that what you would recommend with those who feel that their sugar use has become out of control?
Your question is a very good one, and the answer, as with many things in psychology, is not simple. And if we're going to abstain completely from sugar, without a good supportive system in place for managing, for example, the withdrawal and for replacing the void with something constructive that sugar used to fill. If we don't have enough support, going cold turkey off sugar probably isn't going to work. And as many of us have found, you try to go on diet and you cut everything out, and within 2 days you're binging again because you just haven't managed the process to the best of your ability. So I think maybe a slightly more realistic goal would be to aim for a quantity of sugar intake that is reasonable and that's going to suit your own health needs. There are some general guidelines that, for example, the World Health Organization has suggested that if we limit our sugar intake to 6 teaspoons a day, we're going to see positive health benefits.
No, we know all this.
Then again,
the problem is it's not reasonable. Addiction is not reasonable. And as you've just explained, sugar, like other addictive substances, we want more and more and more of it. Are there support groups for people who can't stop eating sugar? I'm thinking of Overeaters Anonymous. Does that deal directly with sugar problems?
So I think Overeaters Anonymous caters to people who sit with this difficulty, although it's not necessarily specifically focused on sugar addiction. Not that that's a problem, because ultimately, whether it's sugar or fatty foods that we're addicted to, it's a similar process at play. So that is certainly a very good source of support. And if you're finding that you're not able to curb the habit on your own, it's very important that you reach out for that sort of support. On the other hand, clinical psychologists are not just focused on, psychological disorders, but on helping people achieve behavioral change that's going to serve their physiological, physical, and mental well-being. So if you find that you want to cut down your sugar and you're just not managing and you think that you may be to some extent addicted, then I would definitely encourage you to seek out some support from a psychologist who can guide you through the process of making healthier choices.
Well, thank you very much. That was clinical psychologist Dr. Daniel Scher talking about sugar addiction, and we certainly are moving into the sugar-filled season. So maybe just check yourself a little bit and find out how you're doing on that score.